Welcome to the Forever in Their Hearts podcast with Dale Martin Jr., brought to you by Martin Brothers, providing funerals designed and customized to be as special as your loved one lost. Now, here's your host.
Yes, again, this is your host, Erik Reynolds, and I'm here with Dale Martin Jr., president of Martin Brothers Funeral Services. And today, we'll be talking with Dale about the loss of a family member, including knowing what to say when a loved one passes away, the grieving process, and funeral prearrangements. Now, before Dale joins us, just a reminder, if you have questions or require assistance, you can reach Martin Brothers Funeral Services in Vancouver at 778-330-7799. Again, that's 778-330-7799. Well, Dale, as always, it's great to be talking with you today.
Erik, it's great to be with you. You bet.
Well, thanks, Dale. Let's go ahead and dig straight into these questions. Now, Dale, answer me this. When someone dies, it's often difficult to know what to say to the loved ones. What are some suggestions on how to handle this? Should I send flowers?
Well, it's so important. Like when someone dies, and what do you say to them? I'll tell you what you don't say, and sometimes that's a good way to start. I've heard people, they get nervous when they meet, and often it's the wife. The women outlive us men by 7 years, and so it's often the widow who's left behind, and people are nervous because they don't know what to say, and when we're nervous, we often say the wrong things. So it's good to prepare yourself. If you know you're going to see someone, a great tip I have: whatever you say, put it in the form of a question. In other words, when you see the widow, and if her name is Wendy, it's Wendy, it's so good to see you. How are you feeling? How are you feeling? Did you sleep well last night? Did you get something to eat? Are the kids in town? What are you doing tomorrow? Now, all of those things are really good because what it does, it allows the widow just to talk, and she'll tell you, oh gosh, she'll say, I didn't sleep well. I slept for a bit. I think maybe only an hour, but then I would awake and I was, thinking about Bob, her husband, and who's died, and she'll tell you what she's been through. She'll say, I took a sleeping pill. Oh, we had coffee. We were late. The kids come in tomorrow afternoon. I pick up Jason at 3 o'clock on the airplane. All of these things are things she really wants to share with you. What we don't do is you don't ever want to tell a grieving person what to feel. Like sometimes people say, Susan, you'll get over this. People have gone through this before. Time will heal. Don't say those things. Don't pass judgment. Don't tell them how to feel. One of the things I've learned through my life and through my 35 years as a funeral professional is that grieving is a very mysterious thing. And when people go through grief, they own their grief, and they don't. It's strange to say, but people will embrace their grief, and every one of us grieves differently. I've made funeral arrangements, and I've been with families where I'll never forget. There were 3 daughters. The 2 eldest daughters, their father had died. He was 92. Had lived a good life. Well, they were laughing away and kind of talking about Dad and his silly idiosyncratic behaviors and things like that, and they were really laughing and remembering him well. But the youngest daughter was in a terrible spot, and she was grieving terribly because she had lost her dad. But her, at that moment, her grief was telling her something very different. She was very sad. She was crying. She was also feeling very bitter that he had left. So you have to know that you never know where they're coming from. So protect yourself to make sure you always pose things in a question. And I think that's the best advice anyone ever gave me.
Now, Dale, when you talked about the situation, of course you used fictional names for Wendy and for Bob, but let me ask this. Is it important to mention their loved one's name?
You bet it is, and I'll tell you why. So we're talking, let's say Wendy again, we're talking to the widow and say, had Bob been sick for a while? Like, you might not know, right? You think Bob might have passed away and you didn't know he was even sick. And she said, well, he's always had a little bit of a weak heart, and he's struggled with that, and of course we've had some procedures. She will once again go and tell you that story, but it's okay to say Bob's name. As a close friend, when you see Wendy 2 or 3 months after the funeral, it's okay to say to Wendy, say, boy, I remember Bob that he loved to golf, and I know the golf course opens next weekend, and we'll miss Bob because he was part of our group. And usually the spouse will be thrilled that you've remembered his name. It's okay to phone Wendy and says, Wendy, I know today is October 5th. I know it's Bob's birthday, and I just want you to know I was thinking about Bob today. She will be thrilled that you remembered that. You'd be surprised how people will avoid making contact. They'll avoid bringing Bob's name up because they think it's going to upset her that you've brought up Bob's name. But if you if you are a close friend, remember them well and remember the good times, and by all means share a story and a thought. I always tell in our grief recovery programs, we provide weekly grief recovery programs where people get together and they can share their stories about their loved one. And something I've heard before is widows talking about nobody mentions Bob's name anymore. Now everyone's afraid to bring up his name. Well, they want to remember him, and certainly they've had tears and will continue to have tears. Whether they get over their grief or just endure their grief for a lifetime, that's them dealing with it. But let's not forget them, and let's use that name. I spent a little time talking about that, Eric, because it really is important.
Well, Dale, it absolutely is important. And let's talk about something else that's really important, and that's the grieving process. Dale, does it differ much between people, the grieving process, and how they grieve? Is it different for different people?
Well, in the last segment, Eric, we were talking about how grief is so personal, and we all grieve differently. And I talked about those 3 sisters arranging the funeral for their dad, and the 2 older ones were giggling and sort of happily remembering Dad and laughing about his unique ways, and the youngest was really having a tough time. And the second part of that arrangement was the youngest one got very upset with her sisters and said, we're not planning Dad's birthday, we're planning his funeral. And so they had a little tough time amongst the 3 of them, and it was just sort of a perfect example of the highs and lows in grief. When we lose a loved one, there are what we call the 7 stages of grief, and I won't go through the 7 stages, but you can certainly Google it. There's lots of things written about the 7 stages of grief, but they talk about where we go when we lose a loved one. It can be great despair. It can be the tragedy could be overwhelming, but then many times it can be a great relief. Families are relieved of the burden, like maybe someone's been dying with a terrible chronic disease for a number of years, and families die with them in many ways. When a friend or a loved one is diagnosed with cancer, you begin to grieve right while they're still alive. The grieving process, when you start to realize that they're not going to come out of this and you are losing them day after day, well, day after day can often lead into months and years. And we slowly lose that person a little bit at a time. So when the death in those instances come, it can often be a great relief for the family. And that may sound cruel, but it's so true. Many times I've been with a family and they've lost their dad, and they said, Dale, we are just so relieved that Dad finally let go. And so relief is something, great despair is something, and another one that is very common is anger. A young wife loses her husband in a sudden accident of some. She'll go through this despair, but then she'll also go through a great deal of anger. How could you leave me now? We have 3 young children. How do I do? I can't do this without you. You didn't prepare me. I don't have the wherewithal to look after the family. I don't have I don't have the money. I don't know what to do. There's great anger that people can deal with. So, grief can really come in many different ways. And the recommendation that I always say to people is, if you have faith, if you are if you believe in God, rely on your faith and prayer, and ask for help from people. Like our grief recovery program, we've got great counselors that will spend time at no cost or obligation to help families walk through that, and to join our weekly grief sessions. If you can go to your priest or your minister, your rabbi or your pastor, they're equipped and educated to be there to help, and they'll help you with the little steps to walk you through grief. Eric, I'll tell a little story about grief briefly that I think is important. Many years ago, I was a young fellow. I was in university. I was 21 at the time, and my very best friend, he and I were at a late night cabaret at the university. I think it was after midnight, and my pager went off, and it was my office calling, and the fire department had been dispatched to his home, and it was my buddy's mom and his brother and sister were killed in this fire, and it was just so sad. We were young 21-year-old guys, and he was left, just he and his dad. His dad had been away, and our whole community went through this difficult loss, and it was so hard for all of us. And I remember my friend walking hand in hand with him through this process over the week to 10 days until the funerals were over. And to this day, we talk about those times, and he shares with me, he says, I haven't cried. I've never cried. And, some people would say, what's wrong with that guy? He lost his mom, his sister, his brother. Why didn't he cry? Well, his grief is a very unique thing for him, and he doesn't understand why he hasn't cried. And I've heard of that kind of thing before, where people, I'm not saying he went through guilt, but when you're grieving, there can be a great deal of guilt as well. Like, I should have done more. Why am I not sad? So there are many sort of spectrums of the rainbow of grief that people go through, and you own it. It is your own, and you can never tell people how they should feel or what they should do.
Well, Dale, earlier we did talk about the grieving process being relief for some because of the suffering that their family member had been going through. But let's take a few minutes and talk about the death of someone that takes us by surprise. How can we be more prepared for that reality of death?
Well, you know what, Eric, we've talked about how important it is to have a will, and you put a will in place so that if that sudden death happens, you're prepared. And it's good to review your will every year or so. And if you don't have a will, Eric, I'm going to make sure that you do get out there and make sure that you and your wife or family put a will in place. But very much the same thing with your funeral arrangements. I've shared with you how important it is that you talk to your family, and not only talk to them, but take time to write it down. And I mentioned before how there's a wonderful, simple way to do it. You can go right to our website, www.mbfunerals.com, and there's a green button on every page of our website, and you click on that button. It says Pre-Plan My Funeral Wishes, and there's about 10 little questions you can go through and fill out, and there's a nice space for you to sort of blog your thoughts as to what's important to you about your funeral, and then you submit it at no cost or obligation to us. And when you submit it to us, we make a permanent record at our funeral home, and then we send you a permanent record, and we send a beautiful plasticized ID card that says, in the event of my death, my funeral wishes are held at Martin Brothers Funeral Services. And then, of course, directs people to the 1-800 worldwide number that wherever we are in the world, you can contact us. And one of the things that I often do with our prearranged funerals is we have what's called worldwide protection. And it's a little insurance package that you can add on to your funeral wishes. That it's a one-time payment of $400, and when you purchase this, if you die anywhere in the world, you are repatriated back home to Vancouver. So if you were traveling abroad and you were killed or died in South America, you're insured and covered to bring you all the way back home. And I think it's many people take advantage of that when they prepay their funeral wishes, and I often encourage them to do it, especially as we're older and we're retired. We'd like to travel a bit. I think it's the repatriation insurance is a good thing to do. But the bottom line for all of that is take time as difficult as it might be, and you can make it a little fun. I know my wife and I, sometimes when we get serious things we have to do,